I'm Bronwyn Le Grice. I am the founder and managing director of ANDHealth, Australia's only national digital health accelerator. I'm here today to give you an overview of the digital health investment landscape for Perth Angels. So firstly, it's helpful for us to define how we view digital health. Specifically, it's important to recognise that digital health is more than just electronic medical records, health software systems and telehealth. Specifically, we work a lot with companies in the digital medicine and digital therapeutic spaces. These are spaces that have clinical level health claims around their products, and therefore they have different levels of risk and often follow regulatory pathways analogous to a medical device. So they're not straightforward, and they can often be in development for a long time before they reach a revenue generation point. Digital health is one of the fastest growing investment classes. In the last decade, 70 billion or thereabouts was invested into the sector, growing at roughly 27% per annum. So we were set up to specialise in the acceleration of commercialisation in digital health technologies, and we've got a proven track record in taking Australian scale-ups global in the space. We use an industry-led cooperative commercialisation model, so we leverage the multi-sectoral capabilities of all of our members, who you can see here on the screen. And we work closely across the states of Australia with key innovation and program partners, including the Telethon Kids Institute and New Industries WA. Just quickly, because it's always good as an investor to walk your talk, we have had some significant success off our first two cohorts. This was 10 companies over a 2-year pilot. Since we engaged with them in October 2017, they've raised almost $29 million and created 165 jobs. And then importantly, they've also served 70,000 patients. But from an investment perspective, we're one of the only accelerators to have recognised an exit within 6 months of our first cohort concluding. And we've got a proven expertise in taking our companies global. Digital health is not straightforward to commercialise in. Specifically, it's a highly complex landscape. When we look at business models in digital health, it's really important to remember the depth and breadth of industries and sectors who are involved in the sector, and also to remember that the best technologies keep the healthcare consumer at their core. But also in healthcare, the payment pathways and who you need to get around a decision for your company's product to be purchased is also a really difficult path to navigate. Also, one thing that we see in Australia is a lot of confusion about where the value inflection points might arise. In the top line there, you can see a drug development pipelines. We know very clearly that we see significant value inflection points at each of the clinical development milestones through to phase 3 and regulatory approval. And we often see large exits done at the phase 2 to 3 stage before revenue. In medical devices, the yellow line, again, there's some very clear and well-known value inflection points around feasibility studies and pivotal trial data and regulatory approvals, which we know as investors drive investment valuations northwards. In digital health, on the other hand, the evidence building stage in the pink line can take up to 10 years and can often include clinical and commercial evidence building, and can also require healthcare utilisation studies and broad commercial uptake, either in pilot or in market launch, before we start to see shift in the valuation. In Australia, we see some specific challenges in commercialising digital health. One is we're still struggling to get the sector the recognition that it enjoys in other developed nations, very much seen as a sector in its own right. Most US and UK accelerators have specific streams for digital health, whereas in Australia, we're the only group that specialises in the space. And we still struggle for people to recognise that the commercialisation pathway differs to a more traditional medtech company. We also have a lack of specialised company capital and investors. We don't have a specialised digital health fund in Australia, whereas most main jurisdictions do. As a consequence, we see a lot of investors who don't really understand the space coming into the companies, and that can really hold the companies back. Whether it's a tech investor that doesn't understand a highly regulated space or a healthcare investor that doesn't understand tech, the wrong investors can really create challenges for companies when they're pursuing their path to commercialisation. Globalisation challenges, which have increased with COVID, lack of ability to travel, foreign investment review board restrictions, commercial validation and clinical validation, and also changing regulatory and reimbursement landscapes. In terms of looking at some kind of very high level challenges for investors, my personal background is 7 years and $100 million of deals with a healthcare specific venture capitalist. Early to mid stage VCs and institutional investors have processes and skill sets designed to assess and minimise risk, as many angel groups do. Tech investors are generally looking for agile and fast to market companies which are in revenue with an exponential or hockey stick growth forecast, with large markets and the potential for rapid globalisation. Often valuations are driven by discounted cash flows or monthly recurring revenues, and often you'll see business to consumer or straight B2B business models. Tech investors can struggle with, in digital health, the long development timelines. Most companies we see that are successful take 10 years or more to get to market. A complex regulatory landscape that's still evolving, the limited ability to iterate products in a regulated framework, very long sales timelines, slow revenue growth, and extremely complex business models. On the other side of the divide, the healthcare investors. So as a former healthcare investor, we're quite comfortable with no revenue, but we do like to see strong IP positions and clinical data and a known development and regulatory path. When we know our value inflection points and what those milestones are usually, and we generally use a comparable exit driven valuation, and a B2B business model is usually the way. I guess interestingly, we can often have portfolio companies that never earn any revenues for the life of their investment. In digital health, our healthcare investors struggle with the minimal patent protection and IP position, shifting regulatory landscape, which they may or may not understand, the lack of clinical data and the lack of impact of that clinical data on valuation, and understanding of tech can be a gap for those guys. Lack of significant number of comparable exits on which to base evaluation. And again, the identification and validation of a clear business model and who is actually going to pay for this. But let's just look more globally at the investment opportunity. This data is largely US centric, but it is considered, the people that promote it call it global data. It is heavily US centric, but I think it does show a clear trend, and that is we've seen a consistent increase up until last year of investment into digital health, in 2018 topping out at 14.6 billion, and prediction of a significant market for digital health solutions in 2020 of over $200 billion. So it's definitely a major opportunity. In 2018, we're going to use 2018 data because it's the last year that Startup Health did the comparison on deal stage, but what we saw over the period of 2015 to 2018 was definitely a decrease in early stage deals, and an increasing number of deals in the later stages, showing that at least in the US and the Northern Hemisphere markets that we're seeing significant improvement in maturity of the deals as the industry grows. Interestingly, certain types of technology have a different deal velocity. So admin workflow and patient empowerment tools have a shorter path between A and B rounds than other types of digital health. But I think, overall, you're looking at somewhere between 18 months and 24 months for a gap between A and B rounds. We don't have data like this on the investment landscape in Australia, so it's hard to know what happens here. We also do know, though, that per capita and across the funds that we've got, we are seeing distinctly less digital health deal flow than you see in other markets. In terms of global digital health data and median round size, it's kind of interesting to look at what the size of the funding is, again, heavily biased by US data, but seed rounds coming in between 1 and 2 million, Series A between 4 and 8, and a Series B between 10 and 20, Series C edging towards 30. But interestingly, I think is that these are probably not too far off what I've seen in Australia. A lot of the companies that exit our program would be looking to raise between 3 and 5, or maybe $5 and $8 million. And certainly some of our later stage companies in Australia are definitely looking at that 10 to 20 to $30 million rounds. Some of our seed rounds, though, would be a lot smaller than $1 million. In terms of round size frequency, again, in 2018, we were starting to see the larger mid-stage and larger deal sizes continuing to grow, and the smaller deal sizes fading away. I mean, that's probably a response to the fact that we've had a market in the past few years where there has been a surplus of capital, or at least a prevalence of quite a lot of capital in the market globally. I think that's going to be a very different picture post-COVID. So this data, if they do collect it again next year, should be quite different. And again, I guess the interesting thing is just to note that we really don't have comparable data on this kind of stuff for Australia. It just shows that since 2010 too, it's interesting to see that the number of investors active in the market has increased, although it started to come off again in 2018. But we've definitely seen a massive increase in specific investors who are engaging with this space. Just a note on Australian data, we know anecdotally that it's much more difficult to raise here than the US for digital health companies, simply because we don't have specific investors targeting the space. We still have a predominance of our healthcare and health technology investment going to medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Whether that will change in the immediate future is probably questionable, given the COVID-19 impact on the equity capital markets. But it's an interesting space, and certainly there's some good opportunities in the environment for angel investors if they know what to look for and what to, probably more importantly, look out for. Some quick slides on COVID-19. It's quite hard to present at the moment and not talk about it. In terms of what it did to deal flow, you can see from the graph on the right how quickly deal flow and deal volume dropped off the second that first death was reported in January. We now know that those deaths go back into November last year, but that was clearly not public, which is kind of interesting because we were actually on track for a record-breaking year for investment until coronavirus hit. Investors are definitely looking at deploying less capital in the future. In the current environment, certainly portfolio preservation is front of mind for the institutions. For some high net worths, their risk capital may be being deployed to heavily discounted larger company offerings that are currently in the market, and or people generally to conserve cash in times of uncertainty. But definitely universally investors feel that startups will be facing a much more challenging environment to raise capital in the coming year. This was definitely reflected in a roundtable we convened with over $1.5 billion of healthcare venture capitalists in Australia some weeks ago. In terms of some of the opportunities though, COVID-19 can be seen as quite positive for the digital health sector as a whole. It's certainly considered to be a sector where you'll see more positive impacts than in other sectors. And in terms of Australia, what we really think is, and we've done some quite significant surveys, we've worked with over 300 digital health companies across Australia. Access to capital and limited qualified investors remains their biggest challenge, which leaves an open opportunity for angel investors. International market entry is going to be a massive issue, given that we won't be travelling for at least a year, perhaps longer. How do we access international markets successfully? Is Zoom the new way of doing that? Access to talent, again, going to be challenging in an environment where a lot of our global borders are closed. Company survival, about 80% of the companies we work with need to raise in the next 12 months, and it's going to be a really, really tricky environment. And general global economic decline. I think there's some other issues in Australia around liquidation of superannuation funds, which is putting pressure on that sector and leaving them overweight in alternative assets, which will then flow on into whether or not the venture community can actually raise. In terms of opportunities though, we're seeing a lot of forced innovation, rapid deployment of telehealth, destruction of some kind of institutionalized inertia in healthcare. So, you know, we like to say it's the disruption we had to have. A changing reimbursement and regulatory landscape, currently quite responsive, but, you know, has the potential to go on and be properly legislated and frameworked for ongoing reimbursement for some of those key technology platforms. Kind of forcible removal of barriers to adoption. Clinicians and patients have been forced to use the technology, whereas before it was easier to just continue status quo. Definitely getting more sector recognition from our policymakers, but also our corporate stakeholders and the community, and also looking like there might be some potential preferential investment opportunities and grant programs that companies may be able to continue to access or begin to be able to access. So just some more data from Rock Health. You know, they definitely went into the kind of areas within digital health position for greater growth in 2020, which some of the angel investors in the room might want to take a note of. So telemedicine, remote monitoring, symptom checkers and triage tools, which were certainly not at the top of the list before this pandemic. Digital therapeutics, clinical trials tools. Again, COVID-19 shut down many clinical trials across the world, and so tools to enable virtual trials to continue, or virtual contact with trial subjects are definitely on the up, and also clinical decision support tools. In terms of just some quick red flags when I'm looking at digital health, and this is certainly not an all-encompassing list, but any claims made that are clinical or commercial or economic that cannot be substantiated through independent literature and third-party reports, weak or unclear regulatory strategy, or a company saying that they can avoid regulation is generally a red flag for us. If they can avoid regulation, so can their better funded competitors. And also the legal risk that comes along with making health claims and not having sufficient evidence to back it up. Overvaluation, there is a lack of truly comparable deals and exits, but there is a tendency within this space to overvalue. And, you know, the price point on some of these companies is ambitious, given the fact that there's still some quite big systemic barriers to them going global and achieving genuine sale or exit. Failure to identify competition, including inertia, which is the failure to change. One of the biggest challenges for these companies will be getting clinicians or patients or caregivers to change how they interact with technology, and that is a very, very large barrier to overcome, and should never be underestimated. If they come to me with an Australia-only plan, it would be very rare for us to consider them investable, and often the business models they'll need to go overseas might be different to what they need in Australia, so they really need to have at least an eye on the global opportunity. And then in terms of some other kind of big ones, if they don't have voice of paying customer, so not the people that use the tech, but who's going to pay for it, and they can't map that within a healthcare payment system, that would be a big red flag. Voice of users, so there's often multiple users of one of these technologies, so can they point to real data from users that suggest that they're getting what they need out of the tech? Clinical evidence, evidence of solving an economic problem or commercial evidence, a business model relevant to the jurisdictions they're looking to target, a regulatory model that is relevant to the jurisdictions they're trying to target, data protection and cybersecurity regulations specific to the jurisdictions that they're trying to target. And then also, you know, the biggest one for us is always no clear pathway to a sustainable business model, and that would be probably 80% of the companies we see when we first see them. So noting that patients will rarely pay for tech on an ongoing basis. That reimbursement, which is still minimal, at least here in Australia, is usually key to adoption and uptake, especially by clinicians. That you need to undertake healthcare utilisation studies alongside your clinical development, and they can take some years to complete, as can the clinical trials, and that sales timelines average around 2 years. I'd also just caution that anyone suggesting that they can go from, you know, beginning to exit in under 10 years is probably kidding themselves. We've seen some get there in less than that, but most companies, this is a 10-year journey, as it would be with a medtech. So hopefully that was some interesting information. I look forward to seeing you all on the panel on Wednesday. Thanks.